last week's tour, someone asked me was I didn't talk about the church. I suppose I should have said something. I haven't got a huge amount to say particularly about it. It's a fine medieval building. A lot of work done in the 14th century, possibly at the expense of William of Westbury, who was a very significant medieval figure. He was a justice, one of the king's justices who travelled around holding court and dealing with criminal and civil matters. Quite an influential person, and it's possible that he paid for some of the work on it. It's a very fine church with what is believed to be one of the heaviest peals of bells in the world. And for those of you woken up on Sundays like this, or Tuesday night for rehearsal, will probably agree with that. Sorry? Third heaviest peal in the world. Anyway, you've looked down and noticed I'm sure, the garden, the little garden there that is maintained for the use of Westbury people. That originally was the mill pond of the Westbury Town Mill, the head of water there that ran on the other side of the path. So originally that footpath sort of went across the mill pond and the mill head to the town mill, which was situated on the other side of the path. And in 1861 that building was destroyed by a fire, and there's a wonderfully vivid description in the Trowbridge Advertiser of the fire, and the reporter really did, describe it very vividly. The fire set hold. What had happened was that the town mill, we were told, was built about 60 years ago, so built about 1800, round about the time of the Angel Mill. So that period was quite a period of development of the woolen industry. And it had been used as a woolen factory, and the oil from the wool that had been removed or was used in the process had saturated the floorboards apparently so much that when the fire took hold, the floorboards just sort of ignited, and the whole building was almost immediately, hardly any possibility of saving it. At the time, the fire service, such as it existed in Westbury, was a small sort of wheel hand pump that was kept in the vestry of the church there. This was brought into play, but was found to be immediately completely useless. It just didn't work. At 12 o'clock, this is in the night time, the scene was awfully sublime, the roof falling in with a fearful crash, carrying each successive floor and all the massive machinery with it, sending up a column of sparks and flakes of half-consumed wool for a considerable height in the air. And they fell in myriads upon the thatched roofs of the farmsteads and cottages at a great distance around. The scene too at the cottages around the churchyard, which are closely adjoining the factory, became truly distressing. The occupants, partly dressed, were running hither and thither in a stage of frantic despair lest their dwellings should fall prey to the flames from the flakes of fire which fell on the roofs. Every movable article of furniture was taken to the churchyard, where, sitting among the tombstones, the terror-stricken cottagers waited in great anxiety the issue of the conflagration. Their pallid countenances, sitting amongst the tombs with the grey turret of the old church tower in the background, all rendered fearfully vivid by the mass of the picture, of the flame which shot heavenward from the blazing building, formed a fearful picture that will not easily be forgotten by those who witnessed it, or those who formed part of it during that terrible night. Wow, they don't write newspaper accounts like that anymore, do they? You can read your Roman numerals. It's one of the easiest buildings in Westbury to date, because the line at the top, built by Sir Massey Lopes Baronet, recorder of this borough, Anno Domini, and it's 1815. Now, Sir Massey Lopes was a Devon landowner who sought to increase his influence and power by buying the manor and borough of Westbury, becoming lord of the manor and borough of Westbury, because that brought with it the power and influence to control the parliamentary borough of Westbury. In the pre-reform period of the 19th century, electoral reform gradually took on over in the 19th century, but this was what was known as a pocket borough. The borough had about 60 properties that were called burgage properties, and the occupiers of those properties had a vote. And when you consider that those properties were all leased by the Lord of the Manor, the Lord of the Borough of Westbury, and there was no secret ballot, it's pretty clear that if you owned the borough, you therefore controlled what people would vote, because you can, if you're familiar with Westbury at all, as you go along Edenvale Road, you've got sort of typical 1930s, 20s and 50s and later bungalows and houses, and then all of a sudden there's a much older rank of properties just beyond the entrance to the school. Those, I think, are burgage properties, and so they're quite historically they're very important, because they're properties in which the occupiers had the right of voting in the borough for the borough elections. And in fact Westbury maintained its right to send an MP to Parliament until the 1880s when it lost it. And it's that political connection with Westbury being a borough and having sending MPs to Parliament, which it had been doing from the 15th century, explains why the constituency that's now South Wiltshire, I think. So we have a borough created in the Middle Ages with a market, grant of a market, and the whole concept and idea of having a borough, to establish a borough with a market, was that you created, it's like the medieval equivalent of a trading estate. You created an area where you had a market where tradespeople could come to sell their wares, and those living within the borough, tradespeople within the borough, craftsmen and tradespeople, could have their stalls and sell their wares without having to pay the fees to do so, which others from outside the borough had to do. So you were creating a sort of little economic entity in the middle of it, in Westbury, where local farmers would come to sell their goods, buy their tools and equipment to replenish, then repair what they lost, and it was a little economic island. I'm running out of words to describe it. Folks came in, he had immediately, having bought the borough, he had to refurbish all these burgage tenements, which was a considerable cost. They were virtually uninhabitable. He built the town hall here, which was, until the fairly recent times, open underneath. There was the building, the ground floor was put in at a much later date. Market stalls were kept and stored under there. There was a prison kept there for a time, because Westbury had its petty sessional division and jurisdiction, and the prison was kept there, court held above. That subsequently became the library for a time until it moved to the Westbury House. So an interesting sort of history here all around us in the borough. And then as we walk back through MARISTOW Street to where we started, that's one of the medieval streets of Westbury, and as I mentioned to you before, very, very probably later frontages were put on much older properties there. The History Centre at Chippenham, as well as having the archive material, has a lot of published material about towns and villages of Westbury, and also there's a community history website which you can go on to. You're very welcome to do so if you wish. Okay, thank you. Buildings that came in 1900. I've got a photograph. There's a chap whose ancestor built the houses. There's a photograph of this site being cleared, with a tree stump being removed.
Right. Tell me more about this building.
Well, this is the manor house of the Westbury Borough, which is where Mr. Lotz would have stayed, or Sir Massey Lotz stayed when he visited Westbury. So this is his big manor house, and it's the 5 properties, you see. And then he renamed the street MARISTOW Street, because that's named after his Devon estates. So it's
now this portico. What would you call that?
Well, that's
the entrance.
Yeah, the entrance portico to it. Yes,
Yeah,
that sort of extends right onto the street. You see.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is Sir Massey Lotz's.
Yes, he's Westbury based when he stayed here, and this would have been these 2 properties here, with facing it, were the ones built in 1900. which previously had allowed them sort of, they weren't overlooked, it was just a bit of open ground.
So why was he so important again?
Well, he purchased the manor and borough, became lord of the manor and borough, purely, well, largely so that he had the political influence to control the seat. And in fact, he did serve for Westbury here, but at one time he allowed Sir Robert Peel, who later became Prime Minister, to have the seat in Westbury. He was out of a constituency for a time, so we had Sir Robert Peel as our MP for a very short time. Politics was controlled by the wealthy and influential. There was no secret ballot, and those who lived in the burgage properties within the borough of Westbury had the right to vote, but of course they voted as their landlord deemed them to vote. I think example in Ilchester in Somerset, where the vote went against the lord of the manor in the early 19th century, and you look in the parish registers of Ilchester and nearly all the baptisms of children were given the middle names of the two candidates who stood against and opposed the lord of the manor and borough. I can't remember the person's name, but it's a very interesting example of political two fingers.
So this is political wrangling. So
yes.
The only way you could vote in Westbury would be if... How would you vote?
Well, the parliamentary constituency which covered the borough there were about 62 votes, and they were all attached to the burgage properties that formed the borough of Westbury, and those were properties which were owned by the owner of the manor, the lord of the manor and borough of Westbury, in this case Sir Massey Lopes, and so voting wasn't secret. You didn't have a secret ballot. You went out to the open booth where you cast your vote for whichever for the candidate, and so as owner of the borough, knowing who voted for who, your vote was controlled by him.
So there was no democracy as such. I mean, Parliament as such was governed by the landowners. Yes,
very much. And that was just the Westbury the borough constituency. At the same time, Wiltshire sent a couple of county members to vote, to sit in Parliament, and their vote was by those people on a property qualification. You had to have property, I think, worth more than £10 a year to be eligible to have the vote. And that was for the county constituency.
And what sort of dates are we talking about?
Well, this is all in the era, from the 18th into the 19th century. There was a major reform in 1832 which did slightly widen the franchise and get rid of a lot of the rotten pocket boroughs, but there was still a property qualification in giving you the right to vote right through into the 1880s.
So you would say that Westbury was a rotten borough?
A pocket borough, yeah, it was I mean, they were known colloquially as rotten boroughs because it was controlled by one person. I mean, the best example of a rotten borough was Old Sarum in Wiltshire. It was Old Sarum, where there were about 3 people who came out and stood by a tree below the castle and handed their votes out. It wasn't the worst example of a rotten borough, but it was a controlled pocket borough because it was in the pocket of the owner of the borough.
Well, thank you for this morning's walk for Westbury Music and Arts Festival.
Well, pleasure. I've enjoyed doing it. I always find on these talks that on these walks that members of the audience can give information, and I've learned a few things today which I either knew and had forgotten or hadn't known before, so it's been interesting both ways.
Well, thank you very much.